Great. Thank you, City Clerk. I know several of us have reached out to you, making sure that we're getting some good communication out to the community about these opportunities for voting. But then also, I know that we'll be putting out drop boxes for absentee ballots in the neighborhood. So are you working with communications department to make sure that we're getting regular communications out to the community?
Yeah, we just met yesterday, Amy and I and Josh Leffingwell from Well Design, who we have a contract with, working on that communications plan.
Okay, great. All right, commissioners, any questions for our city clerk? All right, we'll go ahead and call for the vote.
Commissioner Hart?
Yes.
Commissioner Lanier?
He had his hand up. Sorry.
Mayor, you may not be able to have seen Commissioner Moody had his hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry, I did not see that. Commissioner Moody?
Yeah, I just want to ask Joe the question on when you said fixing elections, the inspectors pay. Tell me, what does that mean?
It means setting their pay. The charter says the word fixing. So I'm using charter language when it means to set their pay for the day.
Okay, thank you.
I know I hate using the word fixing in elections, but that's what the charter says.
Okay.
Great clarification, Commissioner. Thank you. All right, any final questions? Then we'll go back to calling the vote. All right, City Clerk.
I'll start at the top again. Ruppert?
Yes.
Commissioner Lanier?
Yes.
Commissioner Jones?
Yes.
Commissioner O'Connor?
Yes.
Commissioner Moody?
Yes.
Commissioner Isasi?
Yes.
Mayor Bliss?
Yes, it carries. All right, next that will take us to a resolution to amend City Commission Policy 400-01, titled Statement of Investment Policies, Procedures, and Objectives for Certificates of Deposit. Can I get a motion?
So move.
Support.
All right, moved and supported. We have our City Treasurer, Mr. John Golbinski, here to tell us about this item. Oh, John, we can't hear you.
Sorry. How about that?
Better.
From time to time, we review our investment policy and look for opportunities to adjust our guidelines to see if we're missing an opportunity. And what we discovered is that certificates of deposit are ones that we'd like to further define in our policy. We have the ability to use a product called CDARS, which allows the city to invest large amounts of money and certificates of deposit and have them fully insured. One of the other items that we like to do is there are brokered CDs, which actually allows an investment company to go out and purchase $250,000 CDs from multiple banks within Michigan. And that allows us to capture that insurance capacity as well. And so what we're asking for is to allow us to update our policy 400-01 to give us the opportunity to do that, because what we're doing right now in a low interest rate environment, we're seeing that we can possibly go out a little bit longer with a CD product up to 3 years and capture some additional yield with having the insurance and being very safe.
Great. Thank you, John. Commissioners, any questions? Commissioner Jones, did you have your hands up? No? Okay. All right. Then I'll turn to our city clerk to call the vote.
Commissioner Lanier?
Yes.
Commissioner Jones?
Yes.
Commissioner O'Connor?
Yes.
Commissioner Moody?
Yes.
Commissioner Isasi?
Yes.
Commissioner Ruppert?
Yes.
Mayor Bliss?
Yes, it carries. All right. Next up, we'll take us to a resolution adopting an amendment to City Commission Policy 1100-05 to recognize Grand Rapids Juneteenth Freedom Festival as a city co-sponsored event. I think it looks like Miss Yvette Pittman's going to tell us about this.
Yes, thank you so much, Mayor. Special events are classified.
Oh, hold on. Can I get a motion first? Sorry.
So moved.
Support.
Moved and supported. Sorry about that, Yvette. Go ahead.
I apologize. Special events are classified into 3 major categories: city-sponsored events, city co-sponsored community events, and non-sponsored permitted commercial events. And currently we have 5 events 4 that are nationally observed dates approved by the City Commission as city-sponsored events. The City of Grand Rapids has taken the necessary steps to recognize Juneteenth by way of a city proclamation, and we recommend endorsement of the Grand Rapids Juneteenth Freedom Festival Dundaba celebration as a city-sponsored event today.
Great. Thank you, Yvette. Commissioners, any questions? I know many of us have attended this event for several years here in our community. All right, we'll go ahead and call the vote.
Commissioner Jones,
Yes.
Commissioner O'Connor,
Yes.
Commissioner Moody,
Yes.
Commissioner Isasi,
Yes.
Commissioner Repart,
Yes.
Commissioner Lanier,
Aye.
Mayor Bliss.
Yes, it carries. Thank you. All
Thank you.
right, next. Thank you. Thanks, Yvette, for your work on that, and the city manager. Next, we'll take us to a resolution approving the Boston Square Together Initial Voluntary Equitable Development and Community Partnership Agreement. Can I get a motion?
So moved.
Support.
All right, moved and supported by our third ward commissioners, and it looks like we have Mr. Gracia, our Director of Economic Development, here to tell us about this work.
Yes, good morning, commissioners. So before you is a resolution approving the Boston Square Together Initial Voluntary Equitable Economic Development and Community Partnership Agreement. As you know, this getting to this agreement has taken much time, a lot of stakeholder engagement, and a lot of input from community and business stakeholders, and most importantly, from the third ward commissioners as well. So what the agreement is based on, the city's voluntary equitable development agreement policy, and serves as a guide for future agreements between all the parties and impacted stakeholders. This project, as we know, is a catalyst project for Boston Square and the Oakdale neighborhood areas, and addresses many of the core principles of our city and equitable economic development and mobility strategic plan. As you know, since initially introduced to this in July, we've had many follow-up conversations with Amplify, the Oakdale neighbors, and the Boston Square Neighborhood Association to make sure that we refine this agreement so that all parties had reached a consensus and that we could move forward with this catalyst project for Boston Square. So in the memo, I've highlighted a few areas that have changed since the initial introduction in July, and I'll cover just those very briefly for perspective. So first, a minimum of 40 owner-occupied units has been, the number of owner-occupied units has increased to 40 since the initial agreement. And then also under housing is we have prioritized additional home ownership and addressing other housing needs consistent with the Boston Square Together vision statement and goals of the agreement. Under economic opportunity, we have solidified a goal of 50% of business owners representing traditional underrepresented populations within the project area. And also, Amplify has agreed to create a fund of a minimum of $500,000 in low interest and below market rate business loans to support new business startup costs within the project boundaries. Now, all the parties to the agreement will collaborate to design the fund with the goal of creating sustainable access to capital that helps build equity over time. In addition to the the $500,000 fund, the parties will also develop financial and technical support partnerships and programming to support the Boston Square Together vision and business creation for neighborhood residents. As we heard on August 11th at the public hearing, there was a lot of public comment or positive comments in support of this refined partnership or initial agreement. And so before you is the final version of that agreement and seeking the approval, and happy to answer any questions you may have about it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Gracia. This is very clear and well laid out. Appreciate that. Commissioners, any questions or comments? I know many of us have been updated about this work as it's progressed. All right. Commissioner Asasi and then Commissioner Jones.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Mr. Gracia, for the presentation. I just had a couple of questions, and I don't know if we can pull up the item that was in the packet to talk about one of the bullet points as we talked about kind of the time frame around. It was under housing. It was one of the bold items to continue to explore additional opportunities for ownership. And so I appreciate this being called out. I think for me, I'm just concerned, how will we measure that? And is there a time frame associated with that? So I think that language is just a little too broad. And, I think that maybe there are some others from the project who are on the call to be able to talk about that time frame, or my colleagues from the Third Ward. But I do think with a development this size, it would be good to identify that. And I know that's also in line with our recent equitable economic development and mobile GR plan. So that's one question. And then the second question is around economic opportunity bullet, around the fund that hopes to be created for lower rate business loans for individuals. And so I believe the model that this is based on is the purpose-built communities. And my understanding is that in other community in Atlanta, that is a grant. So if they could talk a little bit about some of the vision for that fund and what that looks like overall, I think would be important. Because especially right now, we're in this experience of COVID. We have seen our country, our state, our local communities to identify grant funding for individuals to deal with the emergency state that we're in due to COVID. I would say that we're an emergency state as it relates to Black wealth in this country. And so how do we look at what are those opportunities? I know obviously it would take some time for that fund of that size to be able to get up and running. And I know that these are questions that have already been discussed, but I think it's important again for a development this size to be able to talk about it here in this final meeting.
Sure. So I can talk a little bit on the agreement itself for the home ownership. The time frame are within 16 years of when the units are constructed, and a minimum of 50% would be affordable at 120% of AMI. So that, I think, answers the first question you have related to the time frame of home ownership. But certainly the intent is to always be focused on home ownership throughout the every phase of the project related to residential units. So while we have 16 years on the agreement itself, the intent is also that we would continue to, if possible, and if we can make it work, that would also be increased. But recall, we've also raised that number from, I think it was 22 to 40 over the course of the discussions about the project.
I think for the last bullet item, thank you for pulling that up. I think this is helpful for people who are watching to see. So I appreciate that. I appreciate kind of sharing again the time frame.
Yeah.
To continue to explore that, are there different sort of guideposts during the agreement where we would say in the first 18 months we would review this again? That's really what I'm looking for. If it is or if it won't be, what will those parameters be?
Yeah. Eric, did you have something to add, Mr. DeLong? Looked like you were leaning in there.
Thank you, Mr. Garcia. Yes. So in answer to the first question, I think Commissioner Asasi was referring to the last bullet under housing. And in that sense, there are other opportunities that exist around the project as we know it today, the Boston Square outline, that the parties are interested in pursuing to provide additional opportunities for catalytic redevelopment. And those discussions have some of them have already been done or have started, but there's more work to do. And the parties are interested in doing that, beginning those discussions once the agreement is approved and we're ready, and everybody's settled and ready to move forward. So their opportunities may take time to develop, and I can't be specific necessarily about them today, but there are opportunities that have been identified both by the partners and by others that everybody pledges to pursue. So what they would do is provide additional land potentially, or additional ways to partner to provide housing. And I think the word italicized word about prioritizing additional home ownership is important, because all the parties agree that that's what we want to do. So, and in terms of checking back, there'll be regular meetings with the partners, regular meetings with the community group, and there'll be times where we come back to City Commission to approve subsequent development agreements as well for other phases. And those will all be times when we can check in with everybody.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
And your second question, Commissioner Sassi, was related to the loan fund. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah. So I know that John Ipple is a presenter as well, so he can certainly add to this based on our discussion, but I will give you some background. So we did discuss that in detail with the partners, and we agreed that the below market rate loans were amicable to all parties. And most importantly, we added the additional language that it would help build sustainable equity over time. The partners were very focused on making sure that those equitable outcomes were built in, and so that money could be reinvested when appropriately into the community, if possible. And so we did not necessarily agree that how that would be done, but we agreed that the parties would develop that in tandem together to make sure that we held each other accountable for the best outcome related to that fund. I'll ask Amplify if they have anything else that you'd like to add. John, if you're on the line, I think you are, and able to speak.
Yes. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Commission?
Yep.
Great. Just a little bit more context. So Commissioner, I see you mentioned purpose-built communities. One of the, I think, really innovative dynamics of this project is that we are introducing this concept of economic opportunities. And so this will be the first time that a purpose-built community has put this explicit focus on economic mobility and economic development. And so this will be the first time that a specific loan fund has been created for the purposes of business development. So as it relates to grants, so we would certainly agree with the overall goal. And so some of the other things that we've been focused on is launching a program called Neighborhood Strong that has been grants that have been going directly to residents. So to date, we are approaching nearly 100 homes, owner-occupied, that have been renovated in partnership with Home Repair Services. So that's been a pretty significant focus for us to really, as you mentioned, right, it's really about creating greater wealth on the communities that we've served. And so the high-level statistic that comes off of mine is, I believe, 88% of the recipients of that fund are African American. And so I think it's one of those programs that have really been targeted to ensure that we're working with the residents, the neighbors that have had the most long-term vested interest in this neighborhood. So that's been a pretty significant piece. And then we have also been, you mentioned COVID, been very focused on providing emergency relief. And so I believe the number to date is we've facilitated over $130,000 of direct assistance to residents in the neighborhoods that we serve. And so that's been another way that we've been really striving to be responsive to the crisis that we're in today. So we're excited about the starting point of this $500,000 business fund. Certainly the goal is to scale it to be beyond that. But I think in the context of where we would like to start, we feel like this is both a very aggressive goal, but something that we feel confident that we can achieve together with the other partners.
John, can I just ask a question? What is that if it does stay a loan fund, would it be a revolving loan fund, kind of a situation, or has that not been worked out yet?
It's not been worked out. I mean, I think the hope and the intent is that the money scales in some form. So whether it's a carved out pot of money or we figure out a different mechanism that allows it to grow beyond that, we don't know the answer to that today.
Mayor, if I could just quickly add, thank you, Commissioner Sassi, for your questions. Very good questions, and I'll just echo what Eric DeLong shared regarding your first question regarding housing. So the intent there is that I'm getting a lot of feedback. I don't know if it's the headset or if it's people not on mute. Sorry, but the first bullet or the last bullet on the housing component, as Mr. DeLong shared, it really is the intent. The language is there really to make sure that all parties are aware that home ownership is a priority. So as other land and properties are acquired, that the intent would be to try and scale in more home ownership opportunities for this project. And then I think I'll just add, I think John and Mr. Gracia shared quite a bit about the 500,000 loan, the below market rate loan, business loans. I think the other component that we haven't shared is that the neighborhood organizations started the conversation to try to get an equity, a pool of dollars based on how much money will be generated from this project into a pool of dollars that the community would benefit from. And through that discussion, it evolved into this generous $500,000 bucket of dollars for business loans. And so I think the conversations have started, and I think the last sentence speaks to helping to build equity over time. So the conversations need to continue to get to the place of what will happen with the revenue that's generated from the project. So I think, you know, in the title of the motion here, or the agenda item, is initial VITA and community partnership, because this is just the beginning of many conversations that's to come. And so the parties were willing to put this language in to kind of get to the next phase of an agreement or of some of the projects that will come from this. And that's the same for the last bullet under housing. That was another way to say, okay, we know we want more housing here. Commissioner Moody and I have talked about having a third of home ownership on this parcel or nearby the parcel. And so and the neighborhood has said we want more ownership, because we know that that's how you build wealth, is by owning things and having assets. So this was language because we're not at a place now to have the land to be able to build more ownership into it currently, but this will give us the opportunity to continue to have those conversations, the city, Amplify, and the neighborhood groups. Very good question.
Thank you, Commissioner. And I think we all recognize this is a really significant project, and there will be, as it moves forward with development, there's going to be ongoing partnership with the city and the neighbors and all those who have been actively working on this project over the last several years. I know I saw Commissioner Jones had his hand up, so I want to make sure I get to him. And then commissioners, if you have additional questions, please make sure you let me know. So Commissioner Jones.
Thank you, Mayor. I just want to take a moment to and recognize my colleagues, Commissioner Lanier and Commissioner Moody, for their work and their advocacy and their resilience in pressing forward and helping to shape a plan and a path forward that is the greatest benefit to the neighbors and the residents of the Amplify catchment area, and in particular, the historically marginalized populations of African Americans and Latinx who live in those neighborhoods. So I just want to publicly recognize their work and know that this is very much a marathon and not a sprint. And I'm encouraged about the power of possibility that Amplify holds. And could be very well a model that can be used throughout our city. So I just wanted to recognize my two colleagues.
Thank you, Kristen.
Yeah, thank you.
Mayor, may I also share my thanks to the staff for the work that's been done on this project, and for the commissioners for their collaboration, as well as the developing partner in this. As Commissioner Jones has said, I think this could serve as a model in many respects for how we can solve the housing supply issue and do it in a very sustainable and affordable way. And I'm sure there are other ways that we can approach this work, and I'm looking forward to even building upon it in other parts of our community. But I also want to lend my voice of thanks and appreciation for Mr. Gracia, who's been part of the finish line, but also Mr. Klooster, Mr. Long, and many other staff members who've been part of this process for a long time, to include the members in our planning department, who Ms. Turkelson and even her predecessor, Ms. Schultz. So thank you for the work.
Yeah, thank you, City Manager. This really has been a team effort among city staff and community members and Amplify and commissioners. So appreciate everyone who's worked so hard to get it to where it is today, knowing that there's a lot more work still to be done as this development moves forward. So commissioners, any final questions or thoughts before I turn to our city clerk to call the vote? All right, seeing none, I'll turn to our city clerk.
Commissioner O'Connor.
Yes.
Commissioner Moody.
Yes.
Commissioner Isasi.
Yes.
Commissioner Repart.
Yes.
Commissioner Lanier.
Aye.
Commissioner Jones.
Yes.
Mayor Bliss.
Yes, it carries. All right, next that will take us to a resolution. Setting criteria for the State Land Bank to market and sell Grand Rapids properties and for demonstration projects. Can I get a motion?
So moved.
Support.
All right, moved and supported, and I see Mr. Klooster is joining us to talk to us about this item.
Yeah, good morning, Mayor and Commissioners. And I'm actually joined by Mr. Ryan Kilpatrick from Housing Next for this as well. So I'll get started with an update on our relationship with the State Land Bank, and then I'll turn it over to the second part of the presentation. So as you know, the city and the State Land Bank have entered into a land banking agreement back in October of last year, 2019. And that agreement defines the relationship between the parties. And it was largely precipitated by Kent County's decision to shut down the Kent County Land Bank Authority, which was the entity that we had worked with previously. In general terms, the agreement describes the relationship between the parties, how the State Land Bank will own, manage, and maintain the properties on behalf of the city, provide services such as quiet title and securing of property, specifically tax foreclosures, and defines how properties that the State Land Bank owns on behalf of the city will be sold. So broadly, the agreement does give the city the ability to direct the terms and conditions under which properties will be listed, marketed, and sold, and designates that the city will also pay the land bank for all of its costs incurred in connection with their ownership of the property. So just kind of recapping the agreement there. You'll also remember that you approved an amendment to that agreement recently, which added the initial properties to that agreement. 55 properties came directly to the land bank from the county land bank in their dissolution, and then there were 6 that the city still owned that we transferred over to the State Land Bank. All of those properties are generally considered buildable, meaning they have the size, access, and topography to allow for at least a single-family home to be built on the lot. And just as a side note, a reminder that the State Land Bank does own more property in Grand Rapids, but they're considered what we would call side lots, and they are not subject to our agreement. So after about 4 months of the State Land Bank providing these services to the city, we can report that the maintenance is going well, and we've established a process that is similar to that which we had with the Kent County Land Bank Authority, where there's proactive notification of any issues that may arise, and generally developed a good working relationship with the State Land Bank, code compliance, and the State Land Bank's contractor. After 1 quarter, we've paid about $12,000 for the maintenance, which is in line with our assumptions and budgeted amount for the year. So we feel good that we have projected well for the costs. So this obviously includes the regular maintenance costs of mowing the lawn, and will include shoveling the snow. But as can be attested by many people, there are additional costs associated with owning vacant property in the city, trees falling down, trash being dumped on the property. But we continue to stay on top of that and deal with issues as they arise. So that's just a brief update on how it's going with the State Land Bank. But then moving forward, having recently received the initial report from Mr. Kilpatrick at Housing Next and the data from the housing needs analysis that was completed, we know that the land owned by the State Land Bank on behalf of the city is a resource for the city in its work to address the housing needs that were identified. And here I'll turn it over to Mr. Kilpatrick to briefly talk about the recommendation, which is in a sense an interim recommendation as we continue to digest the data and work to make recommendations related to the strategies identified by Housing Next. So Ryan, I believe you're here.
Yes, thank you. Good morning, commissioners. This is an important resource. Publicly owned property is always a great leverage point to try to initiate additional housing construction. As you'll remember from the housing needs assessment, we have a need for more than 3,000 additional rental units priced for households earning 80% AMI or below, and more than 1,500 owner-occupied units priced for households earning 80% AMI and below. So what we want to try to do is prioritize these lots for those households to ensure that we're producing both rental and owner-occupied product within the city. And we have some interest here that we want to try to balance. We want to try to get as much supply into the market as we can at affordable rates. Some of these lots are currently well zoned to do more than just a single family house. Others are currently going to be limited to a single family house. And so what we want to try to do is prioritize those lots that can accommodate more than just a single family home first, while making all of the properties available. So if we have a nonprofit partner that comes forward with a great plan and a strategy to build a new single family home that can be rented or purchased by a household earning below 60 or 80% AMI, I think the city wants to hear that proposal and move forward as quickly as possible. But on the handful of lots that can currently accommodate more than a single family dwelling unit, what we want to be able to do is prototype or create some demonstration projects where we support nonprofits in working through a design process to really think about what are the types of buildings that can accommodate both homeownership and rental product that fit within the context of the neighborhood and that provide a certain level of affordability for the homeowners and renters that need it most. So to summarize, we want to try to be innovative. We want to try to get as many new products in the pipeline as possible, as quickly as possible. But we also want to focus on leveraging these assets to the greatest extent possible. And so focusing on those lots that can accommodate more than one unit at a time is going to be the top priority, while we try to build support for expanding that template on additional lots in the future.
Great, thanks, Ryan. So just to wrap it up, so the resolution attached to this item would authorize the State Land Bank to work through their process, which is a well-defined process to market and take applications to purchase property, open that up to nonprofits, similar to the process that we've used for tax foreclosures for years, where if a nonprofit can demonstrate that they have the capacity and financial resources to develop a project that would provide affordable housing, we would make that happen. And then in the interim, work with Housing Next to evaluate what other opportunities might exist beyond single family housing. And those types of projects, as we work through that, anything we would move forward there would come back to you for with a recommendation.
Great. Thank you both. Commissioners, any questions or comments for either Mr. Klooster or Mr. Kilpatrick? We'll start with Commissioner Reppart and then Commissioner Moody.
Yeah, thank you, Jono and Ryan. This is, I'm in full support of this agreement, and I hear there's that word prioritization again coming up this morning, and I do think that my interest is in maximizing this resource that we have. And our next agenda item is to add to it, and the way to maximize it right now is to get creative. And so I really like the thinking around creating some experimental opportunities for these nonprofits to change the mix without changing the character of the community to meet our goals from the housing needs assessment. And so thanks for your work on that. And I just wanted to affirm that prioritization, because I think that there's some really unique opportunities within the 60 properties, but there's going to continue to be opportunities in the future as the city has land come our way.
Thank you, Commissioner. Appreciate your voice, especially since you had served on the Kent County Land Bank as that was wound down. So thanks. Commissioner Moody?
Yes, thank you, Madam Mayor. This question can be asked by either individual, Mr. Closter or Mr. Kilpatrick. I have a concern that relates to the state land bank. Does the city still have control over what land can be sold and which land can't be sold or given to the state land bank?
Yes, good question, Commissioner. And the answer is yes. So that's all defined in the agreement, and there's some nuance to it. Generally, the state land bank cannot sell property without approval of the city. Now, if the state land bank, the nuance is that if the state land bank no longer, for whatever reason, not whatever reason, reasons defined in the agreement, no longer wishes to own a property, they can ask the city, require the city to purchase that property back. So that gives us, again, the opportunity to control the property and to control the disposition. Only in the event that we refuse to buy a property back, then, so we get the first right of refusal. If we refuse to buy a property back, meaning pay all the costs that they've incurred for the property, then we've given up our rights under the agreement and they can sell a property. So in any instance, we have the ability to control until we determine we don't want that ability anymore.
Next question is, what about previous homeowners who once owned the property but lost it? Can they get it back if they come up with the proper funds?
So that question, I'll do my best now. It is somewhat related to the next item on your agenda as well. All of the properties that the state land bank owns are vacant lots. So there are no structures on any of the properties that the state land bank currently owns. Now, your next agenda item will facilitate the transfer of some properties to them that do have homes on them. But the process of forfeiture, the county foreclosing on property, is a process that takes, is defined by law and takes years to go through that process. And properties do not get foreclosed on until they're at least 3 years delinquent on taxes. And there's notification that happens throughout those 3 years. So the county does not sell property to individuals foreclosed on. And the city's process to date has been, as was described, working with nonprofits to facilitate the rehabilitation of those properties for affordable housing. So heretofore, the answer to your question is no, we've not transferred properties back to individuals who have lost their property due to non-payment of taxes.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Jones?
Thank you, Mayor. Just wondering if there is an update of any kind regarding our interest in hopefully one day having our own land bank. I know that there was potential discussion with the state, and I know that currently the only city that has it is Detroit. In fact, I know the individual who runs the Detroit land bank, and I'm curious to know if there is an opportunity for us in the near future, and perhaps even some of the other cities that are close to us in size in the state of Michigan. Just wondering if there's an update.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I can weigh in and then we'll see if city manager has anything to add. That would require state law changes, and there is a legislator in Lansing who's really interested in making that amendment that would allow cities over the size of 75,000 who don't have a county land bank to be able to qualify to create their own land bank. And my understanding is that legislation is being drafted but hasn't moved forward yet, but that there's still hope that it will move forward. So we'll see if Ms. Farrick or Mr. DeLong or our city manager has any other information to provide an update on that. It's a issue that will continue to be a priority for us.
Yeah, Mayor, I think you've covered it accurately. That information was also an item on the agenda as our latest update. I don't know if there's been any other developments since then. And the spirit could advise otherwise, but I think that is the latest update.
City Manager, what I can add is that the legislation has been introduced in its House Bill 5822, and we've indicated support for the legislation, and we've requested a hearing, but the legislature has been busy with other matters having to do with COVID and their fiscal crisis. So we continue to work on the legislation.
And that is not just for us, but it's the way it's been introduced is for all cities with populations of 70,000 or more, correct?
That is correct. Yes, sir.
Great. Thank you. That will, as I said, that'll continue to be a priority, and I'm hopeful that we'll see it move this year. So, Commissioners, any other questions before I ask our city clerk to call for the vote? All right, seeing none, we'll go ahead and turn to city clerk.
Commissioner Moody?
Yes.
Commissioner Isasi?
Yes.
Commissioner Repart?
Yes.
Commissioner Lanier?
Yes.
Commissioner Jones?
Yes.
Commissioner O'Connor? Commissioner O'Connor, sorry.
Yes.
Mayor Bliss?
Yes, it carries. All right, and that will take us to our next item that Mr. Klooster alluded to, and this is a resolution approving acquisition of the 7 tax foreclosed properties from the Kent County Treasurer and authorizing expenditures not to exceed $200,458.17. Can I get a motion?
So moved.
Support.
All right, moved and supported. Thank you. Mr. Klooster, you want to tell us about these properties?
Yeah, so this resolution would authorize the acquisition of 7 tax foreclosed properties from the Kent County Treasurer and also authorize their sale to the State Land Bank Authority. This is a bit of a companion item, as we've already covered most of the recommendation here in the previous item. But as in the past, we would acquire the properties from Kent County and this year transfer them to the State Land Bank for the provision of services that, again, were formerly provided by the Kent County Land Bank Authority. That includes cleaning out of the properties, securing, importantly, it includes going through quiet title as necessary to make sure that there's good marketable title to the properties. The city has already provided the list of properties to nonprofits and has preliminary interest from at least one nonprofit in each of the 5 properties. So importantly, 2 of the properties are vacant commercial lots, which is a little unique. We haven't gotten that before through the foreclosure process. But as it relates to the 5 properties that do have homes on them, really in pretty poor condition, we do have interest from nonprofits for various purposes there. Our first goal is to get the homes renovated, again, prioritizing home ownership for households at 80% of area median income or below. So these properties, once transferred to the State Land Bank, then we would utilize their process to take applications for these properties from nonprofits for qualifying projects. So 2 things to note. There are 2 additional tax foreclosed properties this year that are occupied and that we're not going to be acquiring as we have no ability to manage the relocation needed to acquire those properties. And then again, the 2 commercial properties that are vacant on commercial corridors. This request here does not contain any recommendation as to the disposition of those other than transferring them to the State Land Bank. But we will work with neighborhood and other stakeholders, including corridor improvement authorities, to develop recommendations for those lots. And anything we determine is feasible there, again, would come back to you for consideration. Other than those outliers, we'll facilitate a similar process to what we've done in the past, and we'll report on progress to Economic Development Project Team on a regular basis. The cost, which is just over $200,000, includes the cost to be paid to Kent County Treasurer required to acquire the property, but it also includes the summer property taxes and miscellaneous fines, fees incurred in connection with these properties. And as in prior years, we will work to recoup all of those costs through the sale of the properties.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Klooster. Commissioners, questions related to this item? Commissioner Moody?
Yeah, you said that there were 7 properties that will be going to the land bank today, and you said 2 were commercials. Did I understand you to say that correctly?
You did understand correctly, sir. Yes.
Okay. I just still have a concern that once those properties go over to the state land bank, the state land bank is in complete control of those properties.
The state land bank has control of the properties to the extent that they're responsible for maintaining the properties. They can't sell the properties without our approval.
Okay.
And
so
and not only, to be clear, not only what I do not mean is that the state land bank is responsible for determining how and who to sell them to. Generally, the city will be leading that, and we will provide direction to the state land bank as to what they are to do in the disposition of the properties.
But Mr. Klooster, maybe also clarify too, though, it's the state land bank that has the tools to assist with the clearing of the title and other things that may be needed on each of those properties in order to get them to a space where they can be redeveloped.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, they are like a property manager with superpowers to a certain extent. So they manage the properties for us and have certain legislative abilities that other agencies do not have, such as expedited quiet title. So the relationship is beneficial to the city in that regard. That State Land Bank manages thousands of properties throughout the state and has a very well-defined process to do that, whereas that would be an additional requirement for the city to undertake, so we rely on them for that. And then again, they do provide those services that other agencies don't have the ability to provide.
Thanks.
Now, Jonathan, this may sound somewhat redundant, but help me understand, if I lost some property through foreclosure and I wanted to get it back, what steps do I take?
So there would be no steps to take. Once a property is foreclosed, again, the county can't sell it back to the individual or organization that was foreclosed upon. And under the recommendation in this resolution, what we would do with those properties is transfer them to the state land bank and make them available at this point only to nonprofit organizations for the purposes of affordable housing. Now we are, as you received your report from Mr. Kilpatrick again within the last month or so, there are recommendations that were made that we are, as staff, working on that will lead to that we expect will lead to other opportunities for these properties, but that will take time to develop potentially new programs or resources and have decisions made by the City Commission related to those opportunities.
Yeah, thanks. And commissioners, I should add, so I have some history with the land bank, and you may recall that there was a pretty significant lawsuit several years ago, and our argument for the city being legally able to acquire these properties from the county, which there were some folks at the county who were not supportive of us doing that. We made the case legally that we were acquiring properties for public purpose, and one of them being affordable housing. And so we can always provide some history and background on that. If for those of you who weren't sitting around that table during that period of time, I think it was, Mr. Klooster, you probably remember, that was probably 7 years ago, maybe?
Yes, that sounds about right, yeah.
So we may just want to give the commissioners an update on that when we have a chance.
But Mayor, just to more plainly speak, I think what we're saying is there is nothing the city can do to intervene in the foreclosure process after the county has foreclosed on those properties. The best way for a homeowner to retain possession is to avoid the county's foreclosure. Once that process has occurred and the city then deems to take those properties for a public purpose, we are committed to moving forward with that public purpose. So if we partner with nonprofit or housing agencies, it still is not out of the possibility that the previous homeowner could become eligible for reoccupying it, but only if they would go through those qualifying programs that would be deemed for a public purpose. But just for the county to foreclose and the city to give it back to the property owner, I think is what you were saying, may cause some legal issues if we've not gone through the process of making those properties available for a public purpose.
Thanks, City Manager.
Mayor, I have my hand.
Oh, okay, Commissioner Lanier. And then I see Commissioner Jones as well.
Yeah, so, and this probably fits better under the previous agenda item. And I don't know if this is speaking to the concerns that Commissioner Moody is bringing up, but I know repeatedly we've had a number of organizations and individuals advocating for the opportunity for individuals to be able to purchase some of the foreclosed properties, which was, kind of the way we did business prior to the Kent County Land Bank, the relationship with the Kent County Land Bank. And perhaps if the bill is passed and the city itself could create its own land bank, maybe we could reevaluate that. But I do know that that's a concern for people not, once it has gone through some of the nonprofit providers, because of how much they're putting into the properties to rehab them, then they're no longer affordable for someone who may have been able to bid $10,000, $15,000 on it at an auction, for example, and rehab it themselves and to be able to live in the properties. So I don't know, how do we package that level of advocacy into as this relationship with the State Land Bank is evolving, as well as the potential of the city itself becoming its own land bank. I think we need to be mindful of that through those conversations. The other comment or question, I have two others. The next one is regarding
Commissioner Lanier, I'm getting a lot of feedback. So perhaps if you're not speaking, please mute.
Thank you. The other question is regarding some of the nonprofit providers. And I don't know if this is the case now because I don't know what they have on their books, but we had a few conversations about making sure that when we're partnering with them, that they don't have homes from previous transfers on their books that they haven't gotten through the rehab stage and into the market, because we did find that at some point we were seeing that. So we're not looking for them to hoard the properties as much as we're looking for them to rehab and get them to market. And if they are unable, because for whatever reason, then we probably shouldn't give them new properties until those other properties are rehabbed. And so I know that Jono, in your department, you all are kind of looking at those things closely. So just want to mention that again. And then the last question or comment is I know that there were some concerns regarding at least one of the properties for this agenda item that we are talking about now. And so I don't know, because of how late I became informed of it, I feel like I don't have enough information about what's transpiring. Is it possible to table this or postpone this to tonight's meeting so that we can have some conversations about like what has transpired, the vote for this? And obviously we can vote on it now and then the final approval is later too. But I just want to make room for the concerns that have come up and whether we have had some conversations to address those concerns, because I know they've come up. I mean, for me, it was last night. So I don't know, and I haven't even had a chance, city manager, to even talk with you about it. So I don't know how accurate the information that I have is or any of that, but I would hate for us to make such a permanent decision. And as you just described, city manager, that once it's done, and you really can't legally undo some of those things. So is that a possibility so that I can make sure that I'm comfortable? It happens to be a property in my ward. So I really want to do my due diligence and understand what's going on.
Yeah, Mayor and Commissioner, perhaps since we're talking 7 properties, we could, if there are no other concerns except that one, first of all, it could identify the said property and maybe move the item forward with the other 6 and then come back and revisit that 7th one when we have the appropriate time. Because I've heard some of the concerns today for the first time as well this morning right before the meeting, and I'm prepared to speak to them unless any of my staff members are at this time.
Yeah, that would work for me if that works, Mayor, for you all and my colleagues. If that works for you all, that would be helpful.
So the resolution has 7 of them. Which property are we talking about in particular?
There's a Neelan address.
Is that 546 Neelan Avenue?
That would be correct, sir.
Okay, I'm going to ask John, are you aware of any concerns on 546 Neelan that you could speak to at this time?
I don't have enough information to speak to anything.
Okay. So, Mayor, and if unless the city attorney has any concerns or staff, I would suggest that the item move forward with the amendment of taking that property off the list.
I don't have any concerns. We can move forward with that. City manager.
Oh, okay.
Isn't there a church on that list too?
No, sir. That's the property in question.
Okay, so it sounds like quite a few of us don't have all the information on this. So if we want to, Commissioner Lanier, if you want to make that amendment to pull that property from the list and just move forward with the other 6.
I don't mind making the amendment, but I didn't make the original motion. So I know Joel likes for the originator of the motion to make the modification. So
you can make the modification.
Okay. I move to approve the resolution. Amendment to exclude the property at on Neelan, 546 Neelan.
Okay, so we have a motion to make an amendment to remove that one property and just move forward with the 6. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, so a motion is before us to make that amendment. I just have one question, Jono. So if we don't move forward with a property, then it stays with the Kent County Treasurer, correct? And then it would go through the county's process for
auction.
Okay, I just want to be really clear about that. And then, Commissioner Lanier brought this up about the auction in the past. There were quite a few negative impacts about related to the auction process and the impact that it was having on neighborhoods. And so we can go back and look at some of that, but I think we need to be mindful that there are potential negative implications to the county process with some of our neighborhoods and how they dispose of properties.
Absolutely. Yep. And I'm aware of those as well, Mayor. So I think that's the dilemma we're in, is that, so what's the best thing? I understand.
Okay. Well, and I'll move forward with the motion so we can move forward with the 6, and then we can take a deeper dive into the concerns related to this one property and what options we may have. So City Clerk, can you call the vote on the amendment, and then we'll go back to the amended resolution to move forward.
Okay. So the vote on the amendment. Commissioner Isasi.
Yes.
Commissioner Repart.
Yes.
Commissioner Lanier.
Yes.
Commissioner Jones.
Yes.
Commissioner O'Connor.
Yes.
Commissioner Moody.
Yes.
Mayor Bliss.
Yes, thank you. So the amendment carries. So now we have the amended motion to move forward the 6 properties. Any further questions or comments about that? Commissioner Jones, did you have your hand up?
I did. I was wondering, how are we about record keeping with regards to the foreclosures or these properties that are being made available to the State Land Bank with regards to previous ownership, and in particular the race or ethnicity of the previous owner?
Yeah, that's a.
I can tell you that we don't have that information, Commissioner Jones. Again, 55 of the properties that the State Land Bank owns came from the Kent County Land Bank as they were being dissolved. In those some of them were tax foreclosures dating back to 2013 or before, but others they acquired through donations or other means. And with the number of foreclosures that we have now, it's possible to try to find information. Nobody I know that keeps record of the demographics of
Mayor, Commissioner, perhaps what we can do is we can see if the county has ever used the equity lens in their operation of land bank previously to do that analysis, and moving forward, we can see if we can be mindful of that. But I think you're asking from a historical approach, and we certainly have had people appointed that board, and a couple of you have served on it. And I don't know if that analysis has ever been done historically, but we can go back and check.
Thanks, City Manager.
Yeah, if possible, to the best of our ability, I would really like to know what the demographics are for those whose properties, again, were purchased or were acquired by the land bank, and obviously just those in GR proper. And perhaps I'll have the same conversation with the folks over at the county in terms of the countywide efforts in the land bank. But if we could do that, that'd be great. I'd love to be able to find it, to get that information in hand.
Yeah, that's a great question, Commissioner. That leads me to, I think it would probably be helpful also to get an update on any work related to foreclosure prevention. As Mr. Klooster said, by the time these properties get to us, typically they've been in the county foreclosure process, often for at a minimum of 3 years. The county has in the past provided additional extensions. So sometimes it has even been 3, 4, 5 years that a property has been on that list, and they've been working with the county treasurer. And I know within that time frame, typically there's resources made available, or at least connections around foreclosure prevention. So it may be helpful to get an update on that. And then obviously we here at the city, we've done some work around property tax for families who are experiencing financial burden and who are low-income families. And so it'd probably be good for us to get an update on that work, especially going into next year and knowing that the pandemic is going to have a pretty significant impact on families in our city. So I'll add that to my to-do list to follow up with the city manager on. Commissioners, any final questions before we call the vote on this item? All right, seeing none, I'll turn to our city clerk.
Commissioner Repart?
Yes.
Commissioner Lanier?
Aye.
Commissioner Jones?
Yes.
Commissioner O'Connor?
Yes.
Commissioner Moody?
Yes.
Yes.
Mayor Bliss?
Yes, it carries.
Mayor, and I'll just add, we'll check with Housing Next to see if they can partner with us in that analysis.
Great. Thank you. All right, Commissioners, that will take us to item number 7. This is a resolution to consider zoning ordinance text amendments relative to land use regulations for medical and recreational marijuana facilities and other amendments meant to clarify and correct previously adopted language. So can I get a motion?
Support.
Moved and supported. So that's before us now. And I'm going to turn to Ms. Turkelson, who I believe will be joining us to walk us through this item. Good morning.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. Good morning, Commissioners. I believe Asante, will you be working on putting up the presentation for me? Great, thank you. So I prepared a quick presentation that will track along with the explanation of the proposed amendments, but I'm pleased to bring forward another round of zoning text amendments that includes additional land use regulations for marijuana facilities. Today's agenda item is to set a public hearing for the September 15th with ordinance consideration on September 29th.
I'm sorry, Kristen, if I can interrupt. Am I the only one seeing a large gray box over the slide?
Yes, I think we're going to have to go back to the regular Joel giving her authority to share the screen. And yeah, there you go.
Okay, my gray box has disappeared, so hopefully all of yours has as well. So as you can see on the slide, this provides a summary of where we have been recently. You did adopt a round of amendments that we called the fast track zoning amendments on July 7th. We came back and had a very good discussion on the July 21st, and that was what we called the deliberative track discussion. And then from that discussion, there was some comments from the commission, or you expressed an interest in asking the Planning Commission for a recommendation whether to include youth centers as a special land use. So the Planning Commission did hold a public hearing on August 13th, and that recommendation will be discussed today. So from a schedule and next step standpoint, we are looking to set a public hearing today with a public hearing scheduled for September 15th and ordinance adoption on the 29th. And that is in anticipation of an application acceptance date of October the 20th. As you may recall, these amendments were part of a larger packet of work that was prepared by the Cannabis Justice Work Group. The very bottom row of this timeline relates to the zoning changes, and I'm pleased to report that we are on track to meet the October 20th deadline that's specified in the marijuana licensing ordinance as the date to begin accepting marijuana license applications. So all of the amendments within the proposed ordinance today were included in the deliberative track discussion we had on the July 21st. So I'll start with giving you a brief overview of the recommended amendments and then go into some additional detail. Next slide, please. So in summary, for sensitive uses, next slide, please. In summary, regarding the sensitive uses, there are no changes that have been proposed in the included ordinance for your consideration today. Relative to separation distances, we are not proposing any changes to the current uses that are established within the ordinance. The exception to that statement is for micro businesses, and I'll discuss that in more detail in subsequent slides. Relative to waivers, the proposed ordinance would eliminate the waiver process in its entirety. And so no longer would a new facility be able to obtain a sensitive use waiver. The exception to that statement relates to provisioning centers that have already obtained land use rights and required a waiver, but we'll discuss that again in further detail in a subsequent slide. So regarding youth centers, during the July 21st discussion with the Committee of the Whole, you indicated an interest in hearing the Planning Commission's recommendation on whether to include youth centers as a sensitive use. The Planning Commission, as I stated, held a public hearing on August 13th. And although no members of the public spoke during the hearing, the Commission did consider several pieces of correspondence, some in support and some in opposition of the inclusion of youth centers, but ultimately the Planning Commission does not recommend adding youth centers as a sensitive use. The recommendation was supported by 5 key considerations or concerns. First of all, it's not clear how many youth centers exist within the city, and therefore the city is unable to determine or ascertain the impact of a new sensitive use on the number of potentially eligible parcels for a marijuana facility. Any use that could be impacted by the geographic proximity of a proposed marijuana use would be considered as part of the Planning Commission's special land use considerations already. One of the standards does speak to impact of the proposed use on existing uses within the neighborhood. Third, if an existing or approved marijuana facility or business is located within an established separation distance from a new sensitive use, it would result in the creation of a non-conforming marijuana facility and limit the ability for an existing facility, an existing business to expand. And although not specifically noted by the Planning Commission, I will add that a non-conforming use status also impacts the ability for business to finance certain business activities, including construction loans and loan refinancing. Fourth, if an existing or approved marijuana business is located within an established separation distance from a new sensitive use, it would limit the ability for the business to add a recreational license. which, as we've heard from the business in the industry, it really jeopardizes the sustainability of the existing business, which in this case would be the medical facility. So lastly, despite the addition of a proper definition, there would be an inability for us to definitively identify a youth center. Current sensitive uses, such as K through 12 schools, child care centers, substance use disorder facilities, all require state licensure. Residential zone districts are established by the official zoning map, and publicly owned parks and playgrounds are identified in the Parks and Recreation Master Plan. Religious institutions were slightly more challenging, but they are identifiable through their tax-exempt status, historical or required land use approvals that were granted, and building permit occupancies. Conversely, youth centers do not require a state license to operate, and historically, the city has not issued land use or building permits with an associated youth center designation. So therefore, it would be really difficult for us to retroactively assign a youth center land use designation to an existing use process under different regulations and considerations. So since the Planning Commission did not recommend the addition of a youth center as a sensitive use, the ordinance under consideration today does not have youth centers as a sensitive use. And I will note that as your planning director, I do support the Planning Commission's recommendations for the reasons I've just stated. Next slide, please. Microbusinesses were a use that is proposed for inclusion. Microbusiness is a vertically integrated facility that allows an individual to grow, process, and sell its own cannabis. I mentioned previously that until December 6th of 2021, licenses that are available for microbusinesses are only available to Michigan residents. Next slide. So the proposed ordinance has a somewhat complicated process in terms of review and the land use considerations, but the overall intent is to make it as permissive as possible for microbusinesses to exist in some of our industrial zone districts, as well as our either light industrial or our heavy commercial zone districts. So you can note in the top two rows that they are considered a director review, meaning administrative review, and there still retains the separation distance from current sensitive uses. And then in the IT district, we do not have a separation distance from another facility. And so that significantly increases the number of eligible parcels. In total, it would be 172 parcels in the IT zone district. Then as we move down the table that's before you, we become a little bit more, or quite a bit more restrictive as we move into our lighter commercial zone districts and our zone districts where we have closer proximity to residential. So you can see in a traditional business area, for example, it would be a special land use when a proposed microbusiness was less than 500 feet from a residential zone district. It would still retain the 1,000 foot separation distance from sensitive uses and still retain a separation distance from another facility. But that provision itself would result in 43 eligible parcels. I am working with our GIS team. What you're seeing in that third column is really the total number of eligible parcels. It is not necessarily the total number of eligible facilities, the IT district being the exception there because there's no facility separation to each other. Before the public hearing, I will have that available to you. Similar to the discussion we had with the medical facilities, it is a scenario mapping exercise, so it's not science. But it would give you an idea for how many new facilities we would potentially have for microbusinesses in the city of Grand Rapids. Next slide, please. One of the decisions from the fast track, results of the decision from the fast track ordinance is that new recreational retail facilities are not eligible for sensitive use waivers. And so what that meant or resulted in is 7 provisioning centers, so those that have already established land use rights, would not be eligible or don't have the ability to add a recreational retail license to that facility. And so when we discussed this during the deliberative discussion in July, I did make a recommendation that perhaps because they are existing established businesses in the city, that we do find a path forward for those specific businesses. And so although the ordinance does recommend eliminating the waiver process, the proposed ordinance amendment before you does have language that states that any provisioning center that has established land use rights as of September 29th, 2020, which is the presumed date for this ordinance adoption, can request consideration by the Planning Commission to allow the sensitive use waiver that was granted for the medical to be considered and apply to a proposed recreational facility. And that consideration would be part of the special land use consideration for the recreational retailer. So that effectively provides that path forward for those 7 facilities. It doesn't necessarily guarantee them a retail license, but it provides the ability for them to ask. Next slide, please. So this table here just provides a summary of what I just mentioned of the proposed ordinance before you. So again, the proposed ordinance does not include any recommendation or any recommended changes to sensitive uses. Regarding separation distances, no changes, the microbusiness being the exception. The elimination of the waiver process, providing land use authorization to permit microbusinesses within the city. It does not make any recommendations to allow designated consumption or marijuana events. We've previously discussed that as taking that up as a separate effort in the city. And then lastly, finding that path forward for approved provisioning centers in the city to give them a path forward to add a recreational license and allow their sensitive use waiver to transfer, for lack of a better word. Next slide, please. And so with that, I've already, I think, touched twice now on the next steps, but this is an introductory reading to set a public hearing scheduled for the 15th with final consideration scheduled or anticipated for September 29th. And with that, I would turn it back over to you, Maren. If you have any questions, I will be available to answer.
Okay, great. Let me open it up to my colleagues for questions. Commissioners, questions or comments? So this will be setting a public hearing for September 15th at our commission meeting. Commissioner Lanier?
Yes, thank you so much, Kristen, for the presentation, thorough presentation. I want to bring up the youth centers just one last time. What recourse does the City Commission have as it relates to the youth centers? I'm struggling with, I actually understand, let me start saying it this way. I understand the dilemma that because we don't have special zoning for youth centers, that it's hard to identify which structures or buildings or programs that are youth centers. So it doesn't sound as though the conflict lies with whether there should be protections for youth centers as much as it is tied to defining what a youth center is consistently. So I guess but we know some youth centers like Boys and Girls Club, we know that that's what that is. Is there room for those that we are, clear about? Is there room to create a special license for youth centers so that then we can define where they are so that we can consistently, and I recognize that doing this, and I don't know if I'm suggesting doing that now before a final decision is made, as much as I'm saying, what can we do in order to address the overwhelming concern that I feel like has come before us regarding the youth centers. And if, I look at it and I think if schools are where children go, beyond school should also be a sensitive use. So I guess that kind of ends my question. Did you all hear me okay? Because you started disappearing at some point.
Yeah, thanks, Commissioner. That's a good question. Mr. Colson?
I did. And I understand, and I've read the letters from the community that would strongly encourage us to provide youth centers. And so by no means am I trying to be insensitive of adding a sensitive use. I am a parent, and I understand where the community, some segments of the community are coming from. So for me, I think ultimately where I feel that there's more concerns and challenges that we would be facing in this designation. And I think for me also that the Planning Commission special land use permit process is really the appropriate mechanism for us to use in the evaluation of either a new facility or the addition of a recreational license to an existing facility. That the Planning Commission has several standards and language within their special land use standards that they must use in the application of their special land use considerations. And so for me, I think that is the recourse, I think was the word you mentioned. And I think that is the appropriate vehicle to be using in this consideration. I don't think it's in our best interest to add this particular youth center at this time. This particular sensitive use, pardon me.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Jones and then Commissioner Ruppert.
Yep. Thank you, Mayor. And thank you, Ms. Turkelson, for the presentation. I think I too find myself in a position where I'm really wanting to have further dialogue and look for some form of a meeting ground, so to speak, a place where we can find some form of solution as it pertains to the, I think, legitimate concern that youth center providers have about this. And I will say, speaking from my day job at the League, we have been very active in the city of Grand Rapids, in the county of Kent, around smoking cessation and really trying to do our best to create a counter narrative with regards to children and the use of cigarettes and vaping and such. And so we are very much, I could probably talk for some time about, some of the strategies that are used by companies to attract young people. And I know that in many ways that's separate from what we're talking about here, but I think that the concern is legit in that, we are talking about a population that is, the most vulnerable amongst us, and quite often the population that is without voice, and the potential of having, the temptation that is set before them with regards to having facilities that are near youth centers, and the efforts that will continue to try to attract young people to that lifestyle of engaging in smoking across the board. And so I would really, I'd like to find a way for perhaps the Planning Commission, some way where there's perhaps a conversation with youth experts and advocates to shape the definition of what a youth center is, because I also know that there's been that the Planning Commission is not without, or the Planning Department is not without a definition of what a youth center is, and I know that it can be somewhat unclear in terms of what that is. It's to Commissioner Lanier's point. There are some that are without question, whether it's the Boys and Girls Club, because we know of their work, and there's those organizations that are supported by the city. And so I just think that there's that this particular issue is worthy of more work and more effort to try to find some form of common ground, simply because of the population that we are speaking about, and that is our young people. And yet I respect what the Planning Commission has submitted in terms of their reasons not to include it on the list of sensitive uses. But I'm afraid I have to respectfully disagree and recognize the need for us to, again, engage in this in a deeper way, so that, again, if there is a way to find common ground, let's do it, simply because of the population that we're speaking of.
Thanks, Commissioner. Mr. Colson, did you want to respond to that, or should I go on to Commissioner Repart and Commissioner Moody?
I guess my only, I realize that you didn't add any questions, but my thoughts to your comments are that, you know, if I do say so myself, I think we did prepare a really good definition for the youth centers that I put forward before the Planning Commission. So I think what we all would traditionally think of as a youth center, I felt like the proposed definition did capture that. So it's not necessarily in defining what is a youth center is the challenge. I think it's the application of a sensitive use at this time that would effectively be retroactively applied to existing uses that have been processed using different land use classifications. And I think the Planning Commission, and I would concur, is that the common ground to me is those special land use standards. And the Planning Commission is legally obligated to make determinations relating to those standards. And those standards, one is the neighbor, number 3 for their standard is neighborhood effect. And it says the proposed use would be compatible, harmonious, and appropriate with the existing or planned character and uses of the neighborhood. Potentially adverse effects arising from the proposed use on the neighborhood and adjacent properties. And the proposed use would not be detrimental, hazardous, or disturbing to existing or future adjacent uses. And so there's quite a few standards that should make the Planning Commission pause, and does make the Planning Commission pause, to say what's happening around this proposed facility. And this would be true of any special land use, but in this case, the marijuana facility. What's happening around it? And they are obligated to make some sort of determination that that proposed marijuana facility would not be detrimental or hazardous or impair the viability and health of an existing, what we would think of in this case as the youth center or Boys and Girls Club, for example. So for me, I'm not suggesting that there isn't the ability for us to consider this. I think we're just proposing a different path forward than creating a new sensitive use.
Thank you. Let's go with Commissioner Repart and then Commissioner Moody.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up. I too am sympathetic to these youth centers, and that, you know, what we want to find is the best outcome to prevent these facilities to being right across the street from them. Kristen, this probably isn't under the purview of the City Commission, but is there, as Commissioner Jones said, as a way of kind of coming together, that language in the standards, is there a way to add language to the standards instead of adding another sensitive land use that says for this particular thing, we ask the Planning Commission to take into consideration youth centers when making these decisions? Is that an option?
Sure, we could definitely, it is within your authority to update the sensitive use standards. That would, again, require a Planning Commission recommendation. I think I'm suggesting that it is there. Although youth centers are not explicitly defined, it does require the Planning Commission to consider existing uses, which would include a youth center. So I think that the language is there already.
Okay, thanks. Commissioner Moody and then Commissioner O'Connor.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Turkelson, for this report. Commissioner Repart really kind of asked my question, and that answer came primarily from Ms. Turkelson's question of they would consider. My thought is that has the Planning Commission ever did a survey as to how many youth centers are in the community of Grand Rapids within each ward?
No, we did not, but not for lack of trying. Because we don't have any sort of, we don't have a current definition in the zoning ordinance. We've never authorized a youth center with land use approval or a building permit issued. There's no state licensing or local licensing required. I don't have a list. I don't have a definition, but I also don't have a list to utilize to reference back to a definition, if that makes sense. So we don't know where these exist because we don't have and have historically not created a mechanism for us to do that.
Would it help if each commissioner within their ward at least prepared a list of youth centers for the planning commission?
I think that that's possible. I think you'd have to be working from a common definition in order to do that. So what may be considered a youth center to one might not be the same as the other. So, for example, the definition I created for the Planning Commission was that it was a government or nonprofit-owned facility that provided support services, care, et cetera, for youth under 18 and under. If depending on how broadly you write that, would a bounce house or the trampoline park, even though it's privately owned, is that considered a youth center? So making sure that you're operating from the exact same definition would be critical to that process.
Thank you.
Commissioner O'Connor?
Thank you, Mayor. And I'm just struggling with this. This was a recommendation from the Planning Commission that came to us unanimously and is supported by our planning director, who are the folks that we've tasked with providing us, their professional and public service planning opinions. And, we are eliminating the sensitive use waivers, which I think is a step in lessening the ability of someone to get a license in Grand Rapids. And then we continue to talk about wanting additional opportunities for local people to get in the industry. And while I respect that, I served on the school board, I certainly have a passion and a belief in, providing opportunities for youth to be successful in Grand Rapids. But we've also not, we don't have any tangible experience to say this is detrimental. One of these facilities would be detrimental within reasonable proximity to a youth center. And I personally don't think that, they're detrimental to a religious institution either. But, we have this sensitive land use, whether or not I agree with it, it's there. But there's a state requirement for schools, and the state requires state definition for churches that exist. And being that youth centers don't have that a state definition or a state understanding of what those uses are, I think this puts us in a precarious position. And we always like to talk about unintended consequences or slippery slopes. And what's the next thing that someone's going to come and feel like it has to be given this special treatment in order to be able to have like superseding authority over land use decisions? We have a planning commission that sees our special land uses, and the planning commission has when it came to religious institutions, they granted waivers to some and they denied to others because the impacted party that was within the required proximity came to the meeting, they stated their case, it was determined that there would be detrimental impact, and it was denied. And so, other than getting notification, I don't see why a youth center, still has the ability to have it denied if they can prove that there's going to be a detrimental impact upon, its location. But that also serves for, if a music store says they don't want a marijuana facility next door, they have the same ability to show that it could be detrimental. It's the same as a retirement home, any other use that's in the neighborhood, if they could prove that or could state the case as to how it would be detrimentally impactful to their, their existing land use, and state that case. So I think this is a great compromise to start and allows us to continue to move forward. And I appreciate the work of the commission and the planning department in providing the recommendations.
Thank you, Commissioner. And so, I know many of us have heard from individuals in our community. Hopefully you've had a chance to read the Planning Commission minutes. They did have some significant dialogue related to this issue. I want to clarify process here. Today, we're setting a public hearing for September 15th. So, Ms. Turkelson, we don't need to make any determination today. This is an opportunity to be heard, for folks to be heard on this issue as well as the other issues. So I anticipate that we'll all have an opportunity over the next several weeks to hear from individuals and organizations who are supportive of some of these recommendations, as well as those who are opposed. And we can have the formal scheduled public hearing on the 15th. It'll come back to us as a full body at our second meeting in September. And Ms. Turkelson, if at that point we want to make any amendments, we can do so before finally adopting the ordinance. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. All right. I just want to make sure we're all on the same page that today it's not necessarily about making changes to what's been provided and recommended by the Planning Commission, but it's to set the public hearing so that we can continue to hear from individuals in the community, and then we can move forward with what our final recommendation will be. Any other questions or comments, Commissioner Asasi?
Thank you. I do appreciate the presentation and the comments from all the colleagues and through those planning minutes. I think this one of the questions that I had is, again, like, how do we look at the standards that we have as it relates to how we're living today in COVID? And today is the first day of school for GRPS parents. Bless you all that are going back to school. But, you know, I'm looking at kind of the rise of educational pods, the rise of different ways that people are going to be educating their children, using the virtual systems in our community, and just wondering, I think one of my questions is, how does that play out as youth centers almost becoming, it feels like there's some kind of a blurred line of some youth centers maybe becoming spots where parents are also going to be using these facilities to help educate their children as another option for childcare. And so in my head, that's what I'm trying to reconcile too as we move into this and setting this public hearing. But I think just kind of sharing all the aspects of this, and that's kind of one of my biggest concerns about hearing from the Planning Commission, but also recognizing the role of sort of educational equity in this world of COVID. So those are just some of my thoughts. I don't expect an answer, Kristen. I appreciate the presentation, but I just wanted to put that thought out there as well.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner. It can become complicated pretty quickly as people use different spaces for gatherings as well as activities for young people and youth, particularly if that's not the primary use of that facility on most days. So I see the challenge without the clear definition and the licensing aspect of it. But I also appreciate the concerns that individuals in our community have. So I think this is a good discussion, and I'm sure we'll hear more from the community over the next several weeks. So, Commissioner, any final thoughts or comments or questions before I ask our city clerk to call for the vote? Again, this is to set the formal public hearing for September 15th. All right, I'll turn to our city clerk.
Commissioner Lanier.
Hi, sorry, I wasn't on mute. I was still on mute.
Okay. Commissioner Jones?
Yes.
Commissioner O'Connor?
Yes.
Commissioner Moody?
Yes.
Commissioner Asasi?
Yes.
Commissioner Repart?
Yes.
Mayor Bliss?
Yes, it carries. All right, next that will take us to our final action item. And then after that, Commissioners, we do have a presentation from our Office of Public Accountability. And then we'll go into executive session. And then again, just a reminder that we have public safety at 3 p.m. So this is a resolution recommending approval by the Michigan Liquor Control Commission of a social district permit application pursuant to Public Act 124 of 2020. Can I get a motion? All right, moved and supported. Mr. Canfield is joining us today. He is our leader on all things lately related to our social zone. So appreciate your work on this, as well as the entire internal team and community partners. So Mr. Canfield, what you want to tell us about this?
Yes, thank you. So this is similar to resolutions that you've considered at each of your last two meetings, where you recommended approval by the Liquor Control Commission of social district permits. So those permits are required for a qualified licensee to be able to sell alcoholic beverages to customers in specially created cups, and then those can be consumed in the social district commons areas that you designated a couple meetings back. So there is one business that is seeking your recommendation for 428 Bridge Street, and that is Jolly Pumpkin, which is also known as Northern United Brewing Company.
Okay. Commissioners, any questions or comments about this item? All right, pretty straightforward. I'll turn to our city clerk to call the vote.
Commissioner Jones,
Yes.
Commissioner O'Connor,
Yes.
Commissioner Moody,
Yes.
Commissioner Istasi,
Yes.
Commissioner Repart,
Yes.
Commissioner Lanier,
Aye.
Mayor Bliss.
Yes, it carries. All right. So as we get ready for Mr. Brandon Davis to provide a presentation, I think I'll turn to our city attorney, who has asked me for a moment this morning to just say a couple words to make sure that we're all aware of an upcoming change in her department. City attorney?
Thank you, Mayor. I just wanted to take the time to acknowledge Kristen Rewa, who will be leaving the city for another career opportunity on September 15th. So this will be her last commission meeting with us. Kristen has provided excellence to the city for nearly a decade, focused primarily on our public safety departments and most recently emergency operations. I'd like to publicly thank her for her commitment and her great work in making us better at what we do. I wish her the best on her new journey, to which I have every confidence she will be of great value. So thank you, Kristen. And lastly, I want to give assurance that we have a detailed transition plan to make sure that there's no gap in service to those departments mostly affected. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, City Attorney. And we all wish her well on her new journey and next steps in her career. So thank you for that. Mr. Brandon Davis, I'll now turn to you for a presentation.
Thank you, Mayor, Commissioners, City Manager. It is my pleasure to bring you an update regarding the Office of Oversight and Public Accountability's draft strategic plan and our comprehensive report update. Mr. Kane will be sharing the slides, so I will give him a moment to do that. And we can go directly to the next slide. Thank you. So as you recall, the strategic planning process for the Office of Oversight and Public Accountability really began back in August of 2019 when the office was created. And we started with research and analysis and moved forward to phase 2, which was the collaborative design phase. And in that phase, we worked with community members as well as members of our police department, fire department, and other city staff to really build out the framework that would be used to create OPA's strategic direction. So then we went into an engagement phase, and during that phase, we had to pivot and go virtual like we did in so many other city operations. But through that, we were able to come up with what is now our draft strategic plan and are able to provide community and commission with an update on that strategic plan today. After today, the next step will be for us to take feedback and then finalize that plan, and I'll be releasing that finalized version in the coming weeks. But from that point, we'll do our operational policies and procedures and then internal and external education. And we expect that internal and external education about those processes and procedures to take place in November of this year. Next slide, please. So our plan is built on what we've heard in community, but also built on the National Association of Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement's 12 core elements of effective civilian oversight, which include independence, adequate jurisdictional authority, adequate resources, respect for confidentiality and full cooperation, and unfettered access to records. And in the interest of time, I won't read this entire list, but all of these have been embedded into our plan. Next slide, please. Right here, thank you.
Did we lose Brandon, or is it just me?
Back from our stakeholders, and the police department's strategic plan and our fire department's strategic plan and the city strategic plan. But in addition to that, there were other elements, including the 12-point plan, national staffing, our savings, our 21st study, also recommendations went into that framework. So we can go to the next slide. So as we talk about our strategic plan, and next slide, please, Mr. Kane. I'm sorry?
Mr. Davis, we missed that last
Thank you.
slide.
So as we talk about, it showed up on my end, but we can go back and I can cover it again. So let's just go back if it didn't show on your end. Okay, so this is the strategic direction slide. And again, it was showing on my end, but into the strategic direction includes the city strategic plan, the 21st century policing study, our 12-point plan, the police staffing and deployment study, as well as our safe recommendations and all the other things listed here on this slide. Next slide, please. So in order for us to fully talk about OPA's strategic plan, we also had to look at those studies and recommendations. And in order to do that well, OPA prepared, as promised, a draft independent comprehensive status report on police studies and recommendations. And that was released on August 11th. So in that status report, this is a qualified analysis. And when we talk about a qualified analysis, what that means is that there were some issues as it relates to the data and data control. One of the most important things is for us to be able to do these type of studies or look at this type of data, we have to be able to track where the data came from, how it was kept, and then how it's turned over. And there was some difficulty in obtaining some of that information. So as a result of that, this had to be a qualified analysis. But it's also important that we point out that this report was drafted before the release of GRPD's draft strategic plan. So it takes into account the fact that GRPD was working on a strategic plan and that we understood that a strategic plan would be released, but it was not a part of the actual analysis that was done at the time of this status update. And then the last thing that's important to talk about is that this is a status update. And it's not intended to replace the police department's strategic plan. We recognize and support the fact that the chief should set vision for the police department. And this report is not intended to do that. It is intended to be an accountability measure related to what we've already said and the efforts that have already been put in by our other stakeholders related to our policing and public safety efforts. So on this slide, you see it's entitled Using the Report. Mr. Kane, if we could go back one more slide, please. Thank you. It's entitled Using the Report. And it's divided into 5 categories. So that's completed, some progress, significant progress, minimal progress, and nominal to no progress. So when we talk about it, you'll see pie charts as we talk about this on the pie charts. The percentages are rounded up to the nearest whole number, so you understand. But we see that there has been progress in the vast majority of the recommendations that have been given. Now, when we talk about the amount of progress, there is both objective and a subjective part to this. So as we review it, I looked at the totality of the recommendation and the report that was given by the police department as to what has been accomplished as it relates to that. And I use the standard of a reasonable department or a reasonable person type standard because there are not exact measurements that we had set forth related to each of these recommendations to determine the degree to which progress had been made. So we can go to the next slide. So we start with the 12-point plan, which we know that both commission and our community are familiar with. When we talk about the 12-point plan, it was intended to improve community relations with police. And in many ways, this was in response to community outcry related to the death of Michael Brown, who was a Black teenager killed by police in Ferguson, Missouri. Next slide. When we talk about the 12-point plan, what you will see is that there were some major themes in that plan. Those things included a diverse workforce and cultural competency and implicit bias training. It also included the use of body-worn cameras. And it's important that we point out that this is something that Grand Rapids was one of the first departments in the nation to implement in the way that it did implement. So we implemented those body-worn cameras as well as guidelines for how they were to be used. And another major theme that came out of that report were the traffic stop and arrest data analysis. So you'll see about 42% of those recommendations were completed and fully implemented. There was significant progress around about 17%, some progress at 12%, minimal progress at 21%, and then nominal to no progress at about 8% of the recommendations that were given. Next slide, please. So that major theme of workforce diversity, you'll actually see was a major theme throughout many of the studies and recommendations that have come out of our police studies over the years. So on this slide, what you see is the
Mr. Davis, Mr. Davis, you keep fading in and out on your presentation. We see the slides as your voice fades in and out occasionally. So we're going to keep trying, but if we keep having this trouble because of the importance of it, I would suggest we may need to recess for about 5 minutes, but we'll try and hopefully he can have an impact on making sure that doesn't happen again.
Sure, okay. Just 1 second. I'm going to quickly switch devices.
Okay. Thank you. City Manager, thank you. I was not sure if that was on my end or his end.
All right. Devices. Is this better?
Now you have to turn your other one off because we're getting the echo.
Yes, I'm working on it. Sorry. Just 1 second. I apologize. All right. I'm hoping that this is better.
Okay.
Yes, much better.
Am I being seen and heard? Perfect. Okay. So on this slide, and I apologize for that, you see major themes of workforce diversity. And we talk about this workforce diversity. This is a theme that went through many of the slides or many of the studies that we had. So if you see here, you'll look at, and we'll just take 17-01, which refers to the first hiring class in fiscal year 17 for the police department. And there were 10 total hires during that time. And 5 of those individuals were white. And the gray represents that 3 individuals were Black. And then you see 1 individual was Hispanic or Latinx, and 1 individual was Asian American, and then you see that 4 were female. So if you were to look through this, you'll be able to see the progress as it relates to each of these areas. And what was determined is that there had been significant progress as it related to the area of gender. The police department has put in a lot of great new tactics in order to increase the gender diversity of recruits and ultimately of hires, but there's still significant room for growth as it relates to race. And you can see a full breakdown on hiring from fiscal year 17 through fiscal year 20. About 80% of the new hires were white, 10% were Black, 7% were Hispanic, and about 3% were Asian. I should note that in the draft report, it indicated that there were 7 individuals that were Black that were hired, and that should have been 8. So that is a correction. Next slide, please. So the next study is the Lambeth Traffic Stop Study. In that Lambeth Traffic Stop Study, it was really an analysis of traffic stops in the city of Grand Rapids. And ultimately, it was found that there were disparities in the amount of Black motorists that were stopped in Grand Rapids. And this occurred in 2017, although it reviewed data from before that date. Next slide, please. So major themes in this study included a comprehensive policy review. Data reporting and collection methods was a concern in that study. Cultural competency and implicit bias training. And the department has implemented to some degree cultural competency and implicit bias training now, as well as traffic stop and arrest data analysis and community engagement surveys. And you can see the breakdown on progress listed here as well. So about 11% of those items have been completed and implemented. 11%, there's been significant progress. About 34% of those items have had some progress, 33% minimal progress, and then nominal to no progress is about 11% of those items. And we can then go to the next slide. Then we have the GRPD Task Force on Police Policies and Procedures. This is also known as the 21st Century Policing Report. And when we go to the next slide, we'll have the breakdown related to that. So in this slide, you see another list of the major themes in that report. And there were about 38 recommendations in that report, and they included a comprehensive policy review, data reporting and collection methods, meaning that there was concern about the way that data was reported and also about the way that it had been collected. There was concern about cultural competency and implicit bias training, as well as the traffic stop and arrest data analysis and some type of community engagement survey, which the police department has now implemented and the city has also implemented at a city level. So we see that there was about 37% of those items that were completed. About 4%, there was significant progress. 10%, there was some progress. 28%, there was minimal progress. And 21%, there was nominal to no progress. And again, the breakdown related to each of those things is listed in the written report. Next slide, please. Then was the Hillard Hines Staffing and Deployment Study. So when we talk about this study, it is important that we note that this was a recent study. In fact, the assessment was from 2019. So whereas it's reasonable to expect GRPD to have implemented some of these items, it would be unreasonable to expect that all of these items would have been implemented by this point. But when we go to the next slide, we can see a status update of where the department is. So major things there were some type of formal policing and strategy plan, as well as increasing non-sworn support in the police department and creating a staffing plan, and also looking at that data reporting and collection methods. And I'd point out that although at the time of this study, it had not yet been implemented, the police department has been working on improving its data management system or its report management system, and they are looking at ways to better the collection of data so that it can be used in different ways. So about 18% of those items have been completed. 5%, there was significant progress. 18%, there was some progress. 36%, there was minimal progress. And then 23%, there was nominal to no progress. Next slide. So for the SAFE Task Force, or the SAFE Alliances for Everyone Anti-Violence Strategy Report and Recommendations that was released in 2015, this was built around the 5 peace pillars. And this was really geared toward reducing violence. It's important to point out that this report really was encompassed more than just the police department. It was a strategy report and recommendations that would bring in other entities. It would include action that would be taken by the county or other departments within the city. So it wouldn't be the police department solely. So for purposes of this analysis, I focused on the items that most closely align with the police department as we were giving an update related to police recommendations. So for this report, the major things include crime and violence reduction strategy and technology, body cameras, which have been implemented, data reporting and collection methods, a comprehensive policy review, cultural competency and implicit bias training, as well as traffic stop and arrest data analysis, and the creation of the Public Safety Committee. And you'll see here that about 18% of those items have been completed. There's significant progress related to about 5% of those items. 18%, there was some progress. A minimal progress related to about 36%. And then there was about 23% where there was nominal to no progress. Before going to the next slide, I did want to point out that as it relates to all of these reports and recommendations, the review was on the totality. In some ways, the police department's strategic plan has adopted explicitly some of these items, and in other ways, they have pivoted toward other directions. So this report gives Commission and community an update on those recommendations, although some of them may have been the choice not to implement based on the best practice or procedure for the department. So one of those major themes, again, was the creation of the Public Safety Committee, and we can go to the next slide. One of the questions that I have heard from the dais and from the community has been related to our public safety boards and task forces. And the question has been, how do these things work together? Where's the interaction between our public safety boards and task forces? So I wanted to lay out each of the current state of each of those, and we could talk more as we go forward. But we have the Public Safety Committee, which is the staff liaison is Mr. Kane, and it advises City Commission, and appointments to that committee are done by the mayor and commission. And really the role of that committee is to review and provide recommendations to commission on public safety matters, and it's created via city ordinance. Our Community Relations Council similarly is appointed by mayor and commission or with commission approval, but it advises the City Commission as well as our Diversity and Inclusion Office, and it discourages and prevents discriminatory practices. That's their charge. And provides advice to commission regarding discrimination. And that's based on ordinance, specifically our human rights ordinance. The Civilian Appeals Board is an appellate body. It's unique because it has this function that's different than all of the other boards. The appointment is done by mayor and commission, but they provide their findings to the city manager through the Office of Oversight and Public Accountability. So essentially, the Civilian Appeals Board does not advise commission like the other boards in which there are appointments by the mayor commission. It instead provides findings to the manager. Our SAFE Task Force was originally established as a mayoral task force, and it makes recommendations to commission, and it has an anti-violence initiative that partners with community and businesses to solve issues really geared toward 15 and 24-year-old residents. And it was created, again, by Mayor Hartwell. So then we have the Chiefs Advisory Council and what will be OPA's Advisory Council. And both of these councils are created at the discretion of that departmental level director. So the Chiefs Advisory Council is created at the discretion of the chief. And OPA's Advisory Council is created at the discretion of the director. And the idea behind it is to allow to get advice related to policy and operational matters, including but not limited to community engagement and departmental strategy for both the director of OPA as well as the police chief. Next slide, please. So what you're looking at here is a graphic that really describes that appointment process as well as the way that data is given or who it advises, who these different groups advise. So when you look at City Commission, and if you were to follow that long path that takes you to the Public Safety Committee, the Community Relations Committee, and the SAFE Task Force, really what is depicted here is that the commission and mayor appoint these bodies, and they also provide feedback to that body. And when you look at the Civilian Appeals Board, City Commission appoints, but the feedback is provided to the city manager. And then when you see both the police department and the Office of Oversight, their advisory councils provide feedback and direction directly to those individuals. We should point out that for the Chiefs Advisory Council, OPA's Advisory Council, as well as the Community Relations Committee, there has been a recent review of those practices and that body's responsibilities and roles. The other three bodies, there has not been a recent review, and part of what OPA's strategic plan says is that we will provide that review, and we do plan to do that work. Next slide, please. So that takes us to the draft Office of Oversight and Public Accountability Strategic Plan. Next slide. And it's built on our values, which are true justice. And when we talk about that, we're talking about transparency, responsibility, unity, equity, and justice. Transparency says we're always being upfront and honest about what we do and say. Responsibility says we're always being accountable and considering the big picture. Unity is always working to build bridges, and equity is always advancing just outcomes and opportunities by leading with racial equity to address root causes of disparity. And then justice really talks about always operating with integrity and doing the right thing. Next slide. The vision of the office is that the city of Grand Rapids will be nationally recognized as a place where there are just outcomes in our public safety departments and justice system, and heal relationships between community and our public safety departments. This vision is really built in part by taking in what the city's strategic plan says and all of the data that has gone into the city strategic plan and the feedback that has been received by commission and also by community. But then we move forward to the mission, which guides the day-to-day work of OPA. And that's through targeted change, accountability, restorative justice, empowerment, and engagement. OPA will help create and improve just outcomes and respectful relationships between public safety and community. So that means that all of the work that we are doing on a day-to-day basis should be guided by our values and by the mission of the department. And this mission was prepared in partnership with our collaborative design team, which included those stakeholders from community and our internal groups like police and fire. Next slide. So our strategic priorities are CARE Plus. That's change, accountability, restorative justice, empowerment, engagement, and plus. And we've talked about these before, so I won't spend too much time going into them in detail. But change really looks at that policy level and making sure that we improve public safety policies. Accountability looks at improving individual, supervisory, and organizational accountability. And then restorative justice makes our department unique because it's about reducing barriers to trust that have been created by systemic inequities in the criminal justice system. So it's an acknowledgement that there have been barriers to trust and that there have been inequities. And it's a statement that our department will work to do what is necessary to make changes. And this comes directly from the city's strategic plan, where the city has said that it will work in that area. Next slide, please. Empowerment and engagement is about enhancing communication and education with the public regarding our public safety matters. And then plus is that area that allows that OPA to do other work at the discretion of the city manager, including investigating waste, abuse, fraud, or corruption in city operations, and assisting with other pertinent issues. This recognizes that our main focus is on our public safety operations, but there are other areas where investigatory needs may be necessary, and the city manager at his discretion can deploy us to perform that work. Next slide. So under change, our first objective is embedding equity into all public safety operations. So I won't read each strategy under each objective, but I will point out that we follow in large part some of the direction of the city's strategic plan. So that's disaggregating all public safety data and evaluating the racial equity impacts of that public safety data, and working in partnership with the Office of Equity and Engagement and other departments to ensure a racial equity lens is applied to our budgetary requests. Next slide. Next, thank you. Objective 2 is to evaluate current policies and practices and procedures with an eye for innovation and collaboration. So that's developing an OPA advisory committee to ensure that community voice is included in the evaluation of policy, comparing GRPD and GRFD policies, training, and other systemic issues to the policies training of other public safety departments and best practice in policing and reform. Next slide, please. Objective 3 is evaluating and recommending innovative policing strategies that promote safety while simultaneously creating a path to healthy relationships between police and community. So that talks about those crime reduction strategies and partnerships in our areas of recruitment and retention, as well as working with GRPD to reimagine policing and ensuring that staff from OPA responds to all GRPD involved shootings to monitor, not to take over a scene, but to monitor what is happening, to have that additional layer of accountability. Next slide. Under accountability, we first talk about fully equipping the Office of Oversight and Public Accountability to serve Grand Rapidians. So that's seeking appropriate resourcing for the department, leveraging technology to improve the oversight of public safety operations, and designing that hybrid oversight model that is tailored toward Grand Rapids and allows for complaint review and departmental auditing. Next slide, please. So this continues that first objective and talks about the level of training that is necessary in order for OPA to really work in this area. So it's providing that additional level of training as well as strategically leveraging outside funding in order to support the work of OPA. Next slide. This talks about improving our internal complaint processes through increased innovation and collaboration. So it's evaluating GRPD's internal affairs policies and practices. It's looking at organizational trends and employee discipline. It is monitoring and reviewing internal affairs investigations of every GRPD and GRFD complaint. It's also serving as a place that can receive complaints and perform preliminary analysis of those complaints, and ensuring that the findings of internal affairs are shared publicly. Next slide. This slide really talks about evaluating and improving our Civilian Appeals Board operations. So we've already begun to implement that by having OPA serve as the city liaison to the Civilian Appeals Board. We'll also create updated marketing materials that'll talk about these processes and policies so that our community can understand and be educated related to it. We'll evaluate the existence of conflicts of interest, as well as adjust our meeting logistics to include, adjusting meeting location, virtual capabilities, and structure in order to increase community participation and ensuring that those findings are reported publicly. Next slide. This restorative justice aspect, again, is about identifying systemic issues that cause disparate outcomes in the justice system. So we're excited to partner with the city's attorney's office to address historical systemic inequities and to create alternatives that can be utilized in addition to traditional prosecution, as well as recommending the decriminalization of crimes or changes to policies and ordinances and laws that disparately impact communities of color. We'll implement programming that assists formerly incarcerated individuals, as well as implement expungement programs and other strategies that help the ability of community members to obtain employment and housing after obtaining a criminal conviction. And as you know, we were working on that pre-COVID and had to pivot, but we're excited to continue that work. Next slide, please. This slide talks about implementing programming that facilitates reconciliation and healing between community and public safety. So this is about identifying opportunities for reconciliation by utilizing victim and offender restorative justice practices, as well as working on the creation of community mediation programs that focuses on non-disciplinary resolutions of complaints and facilitating discussion regarding understanding the racist origins and historic tension between public safety and police. Next slide. This slide talks about using data and statistical analysis to evaluate public safety practices and recommend changes that address those inequities. So this really looks at doing the type of work and detailed analysis that will be a part of a traffic stop study or an arrest study, and evaluating those trends and complaints and finding those type of complaints. So it's important that we note that there isn't a firm timeline related to that traffic stop or arrest study at this point, but there is a commitment that we will complete that work. But we need to continue to evaluate where we are and our current levels in order to be able to say when those arrest studies or traffic studies will take place. Next slide. That takes us to our fourth strategic priority, which is empowerment and engagement. And that's really talking about increasing engagement and transparency regarding public safety matters. So that's working with other departments, and that includes our communications department and our police department, and equity and engagement and our fire department, to really, and also the Office of Innovation and Customer Service, in order for us to increase the amount of public safety data that is available to the public and identify our outreach and engagement gaps in order to close those gaps. We're creating pathways to elevate community voice, which was a priority that was stated in the city's strategic plan, as well as promoting and maintaining a strong digital presence on social media and on our web pages. We're producing semi-annual reports regarding our complaint analysis, operational updates, and other relevant observations. So really that talks about accountability for OPA. If we're going to be a department that holds other departments accountable, we need to be accountable ourselves, and we need to be transparent ourselves. So that specific strategy talks about how we will be accountable and how we will be transparent. And that's through making sure that there are semi-annual reports regarding that data. Next slide. Objective 2 talks about that education of community regarding the applicable laws and policy in order to aid in community understanding and to aid in crime reduction. So that's implementation of a Civil Rights Youth Academy and hosting a citywide law day, as well as designing and implementing a Know Your Rights and Responsibilities program, which we know this commission has been interested in it for some time. Also educating community regarding the function of the Office of Oversight and Public Accountability, and evaluating and aligning those roles and responsibilities of our public safety boards and task forces. And we talked about that earlier on, where we talked about our current state and then a future evaluation of where we go. Next is also partnering with community. So on this next objective, you see it's about creating opportunities to work in partnership with community to design and recommend changes that support making our community a place where all people feel safe and are safe at all times. And you know that is a part of our public safety initiative, where we talk about having a safe community in the city's strategic plan. It is that all people feel safe and are safe at all times in our community. So OPA has adopted that as part of its strategic plan, and that's creating pathways to those positive relationships and identifying and implementing non-traditional civilian crime reduction strategies, as well as implementing that accountability and safety and ambassador program and identifying responsible methods and options for reimagining policing in Grand Rapids. Next slide. This takes us to our last objective, which is under that plus category that talks about providing oversight in other city operations at the direction of the city manager. So that's investigating and reporting queries regarding waste, abuse, fraud, and corruption, as well as educating community regarding citywide complaint processes related to other areas, and promoting accountability in all government operations and activities, as well as partnering with the Office of Equity and Engagement to perform investigations, including but not limited to issues involving the city's human rights ordinance. Next slide. So I've talked about some of these programming efforts, so I won't go into them into much detail, but I do want to point out some of the things that are exciting that we will be doing, and that's Operation Fresh Start, which is that expungement clinic that we've been talking about, as well as Regrow, which is the Returning Citizen Reentry Program. It's important that we talk about our program Big Ups, and that's our public safety commendation program. I'm passionate about this program because although OPA's responsibility is to hold the GRPD as well as GRFD accountable, it's also important that we talk about the positive things that are being done in our community by our public safety staff every day. And in order for community to begin to build trust, they have to understand or be exposed to those positive things as well. So our Big Ups program is designed to encourage community to be a part of that conversation and to help us talk about those great things that are being done by our public safety staff. Next slide, please. So when we talk about implementation, implementation is really built around these next steps, which include creating our procedures to operationalize the strategies detailed in this plan, redesigning OPA's website to make access to data and complaint tools readily accessible, conducting that internal and external education, as well as reporting out on the progress of this plan on a semi-annual basis. We'll be working in partnership with our stakeholders and to ensure that all people feel safe and are safe at all times in our community, as well as working to recruit talented staff to help execute the mission of OPA by pursuing justice. I'm excited that we have been in the process of interviewing for the position that was approved by commission. And again, I'm grateful for that added resource. And it is my hope that we will complete that process within the next several weeks. Next slide, please. So I hope this presentation has provided an update related to both OPA's draft strategic plan and our draft report related to those recommendations. And at this time, if there was any questions, I am open to them at this time. Thank you.
Mayor, before you open the floor, may I just offer my appreciation to Mr. Davis for the work, but not only to him, but to all of his staff, to include Ms. Dixon and all the interns who worked so hard in the Labor Relations Office. I also want to thank members of our community for providing feedback, community-based organizations that have partnered with us. Also want to thank all the other city departments who similarly who have collaborated with the police department in helping them with their strategic plan, our law department, budget office, human resources office, 311, innovation office, and many others for their support, as well as our police chief, Chief Payne, who has been very open and supportive to not being afraid of having accountability and oversight. He and many other members of his department have embraced now the concept of oversight. And I want to thank Chief Lehman as well for also embracing this level of transparency and accountability. But most importantly, I want to thank you all for being early adopters of this. This did not, conversation around department oversight, around other communities, did not start in June. It is something that we began talking about in 2019 with our strategic direction. And it has put us in position not to be reactionary, but continuing with what we knew was the need to do things to further our ability to increase trust, transparency, and accountability. And we just so happen to be positioned to be more responsive to the circumstances that have presented itself, given all of the concerns about social justice and civil unrest. So again, my appreciation to all of you. So Mayor, with that, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, City Manager. All right, I will open it up to my colleagues for questions and comments before we finish up this morning and go into executive session. Commissioner Ruppert?
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. Thank you, Brandon. Clearly, boy, just like the chief, you have just been working tirelessly, and that is a lot of work, a huge body of research and compilation to make, and so it's greatly appreciated. And I have a lot of things that I appreciate in there: the restorative justice piece, the coordination of the various boards, and I just had two questions. One, I won't put you on the spot to answer now, but I just wanted to ask it. Is, you know, with regarding to resources, we added the position. You've got some really aggressive goals for year one. You know, what are the resources that you currently have within your department enough for you to accomplish those goals in the first year? So you don't have to respond to that publicly, but you know, I think that that's something that I'm interested in talking with you and the city manager about, to make sure that we resource your work appropriately. Second question is about the survey. I didn't take it. I clicked on it and I really appreciated the open feedback format of it, you know, where you just gave people a chance to give narrative feedback. And I wondered, with this comprehensive report, you know, where you compiled all of this feedback we've gotten from the community over the last 5 years, if there's a question in there, or a question could be included at some other point of saying what's missing, what still resonates, and what is no longer relevant. Because as the conversation around public safety has evolved, given the recent things, and you mentioned this in one of your slides, that the department didn't pursue certain things because they were no longer relevant, or there were best practices that kind of came to light since those things were recommended. And I just do think that some of the things that maybe we were talking about 5 years ago are no longer relevant. And some of them probably still resonate very highly. And then maybe given the new reality, there's some things that could be missing. And so because I didn't click through to the end of the survey, I've got my opportunity to give feedback in different ways. I just wondered if there's some sort of feedback around that comprehensive report included in that.
Thank you, Commissioner. As it relates to the comprehensive report, there was not a mechanism that was set forth for feedback on the report itself, because it was intended to be a status update on of where the city is or where the department is related to those recommendations. It wasn't intended to be that source to get that information on how the public thought the department should be operating operationally. However, I have been talking to the chief and other members of the department, and there will be opportunities for those types of discussions to talk about those type of things. And we think that is a very important thing to talk about. I also want to echo something that you said and make sure that I'm very transparent and supportive of this point. And that is that I wholeheartedly recognize that not everything in these reports should still be implemented. And I recognize that our department has been doing a great deal of work to look at what should be happening as it relates to it, and has been listening to the feedback from community. And in some ways, some of that feedback no longer is reflected in those reports. So this report is intended to say we need to be accountable to the things of the past. But what I'm excited about is the department's strategic plan, which I hope will lead us into the future.
Yeah, and let me just add. I think you hit it on the nail that the report, the review, the audit, if you will, is over the past 5 years. The plan that the department is working on is looking forward for the next 3 years more. And I think what the report can do is inform the chief as he finalizes his strategic plan to look at those areas that either have not been done or have not been fully completed yet, to assess whether or not that those still need to be in the plan moving forward. And perhaps when he comes back on the 29th, he could speak to some of those areas, because he didn't have the benefit of this analysis while he was developing his plan.
Thank you. Commissioner Lanier, did you have your hand up?
Thank you, Mr. Davis, for a great presentation. Thank you for the thoroughness and looking at the various reports with a lot of pressure from, external forces with everything going on with COVID and the unrest and so many other issues that we're trying to address. So thank you for bringing that full circle here so that we can kind of see our progress. I have a question about, thank you. I think the strategic plan really kind of tells a story about your work and what's expected. And so I'm curious about how, and I know you're surveying and things of that nature, but how would one engage with the department in the event that they are experiencing something that they would want the department to review? And I don't know if that's internally or externally, but I think, and maybe perhaps because you're not fully staffed, maybe you're not at that place yet where you'll be taking those types of inquiries, but just curious to know, what will that process look like so that the public will know, if they're experiencing this, not only with the PD or the FD, but with the plus, as you outlined, there are other areas where there will be oversight.
Thank you, Commissioner. As it relates to receiving those complaints, specific to public safety matters at this point, we've already begun the process of accepting complaints. So we do that a few ways. When the building was, before COVID, part of it was walk-in traffic, right? So community members could walk into our office, which is on the 4th floor of City Hall, and could make a complaint that way. There's also mechanisms to do that via OPA's website, as well as by calling into OPA. They could either call 311 or they could call OPA directly. OPA's direct line is 616-456-4OPA. So that's a way for the community to reach out and make those type of complaints. One of the things that we talked about in the strategic plan is making sure that the process for doing that is simplified. So we'll be editing and working with our customer service and innovation department to make sure that our website is as simple as possible. that is intuitive, so that when members of the community come there, they can just go and figure out how to do it in different formats. I'd also point out that the police department already does have some of that ability on their website as well. There is a way for community to make those complaints there, but the next step for us is to create our operational procedures, and those operational procedures will really provide a more detailed analysis of how each of those processes will work.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioners, other questions or comments? Commissioner Jones?
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Brandon, Mr. Davis, for your very thorough presentation. I really appreciate, in particular, the strategic objectives that have been developed. I think that those are well thought out, and they speak to the issues at hand. I also want to ask that, or I want to recognize that the workforce diversity slide that you included in your presentation really speaks to, again, the importance of engaging in an effort to try to capture or create the most diverse pool in terms of candidates. And I want to again put a word out there for the Police Academy of Grand Rapids Community College, and the fact that they have individuals who are quite often residents of the city. These are individuals quite often who've grown up, who've wanted to be in law enforcement, and they're at CC. And so they happen also quite often to mirror the demographic of our city. And so really want to speak about what I see as a great opportunity to change that dynamic and have a police force that better mirrors the demographic of our city. Also want to commend you on what you have listed for your planned programming efforts. In particular, I couldn't agree more with the importance of the Big Ups program. There's definitely a need to recognize the good work that's being done on a daily basis with our department, and to highlight officers who are in need of positive reinforcement, in particular those who, again, are working diligently in community and seeing the benefit of building very solid relationships, authentic relationships in community. And I think lastly, I really want to encourage you to continue down the path of availing yourself and the department in working collectively side by side with the chief. I think that the plan of the police department, coupled with this plan, has the potential to create some really, really solid outcomes that could, again, be a model for other cities, but most importantly, could bring about a better outcome for our city and for our community, in particular those in our community who have not had positive relationships with law enforcement. And I think, again, working together, there's the potential to do really, really, really big things. And so my hope is that the department recognizes the benefit that OPA brings to the table, and the fact that this is very much it's not about any warring plans or a competitive process between your plan and the chief's plan. This really is about trying to do this in a way that, again, highlights both the plans that you all have presented, and two strategies that could, again, lead us to better outcomes. So thank you for your work, and I look forward to the work going forward.
Thanks, Commissioner. All good points. And I want to echo a couple things you said, but one in particular. I just met yesterday with Dr. Pink, and I think there's a really huge opportunity that we have to better partner with GRCC around recruiting. So thank you for bringing that up. Others, Commissioner Asasi?
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Mr. Davis, for the presentation. I'll echo that and all that were involved with the creation. My question, I just wanted to really add to what Commissioner Rephart said around what is needed to execute these strategic plans. And I think that while we've had these conversations and presentations about the intent and a timeline for our public safety process, many people have reached out to me and perhaps others of you, and that's why the question was asked around what does this look like? What does this mean in terms of dollars? And how can we talk about a plan without, identifying what are the resources that will be needed to move forward? So I recognize the question was answered, but I do want to also just echo that point as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Commissioners, any other comments or questions for Mr. Davis? I'll add with one. I mean, so first off, Mr. Davis, thank you for all your hard work. You, your entire team, the community who has come alongside and really helped create this, what I see as a really strong and robust plan as we move towards transformation and reform. I appreciated the breakdown of the boards and task forces. And I think as a body, we should probably have a little bit more conversation about this. I noticed that the Safe Alliance isn't on here, the group that gets together that actually Mayor Hartwell started when he was here, that's really specific around gun violence. And I know that since he left office, that has really become a community-led group. But I do think some of their work is really valuable and aligned with what we're doing. It may be nice to better understand the other community groups that are meeting that are aligned with this work, just so that we're more informed about the different work being done throughout the community that is aligned with our work. And then specifically about the SAFE task force, I think it may be worthwhile for us to have a conversation. I see that I know a couple of years ago, we talked about having regular reports and some of that work really fall under public safety. I'm not sure how that has progressed, but I do think it's worthwhile to take a look at that. I know since I've been mayor, I don't believe the appointment for that body goes through the appointment committee. I know I haven't been involved in who's around that table. Unfortunately, I'm not even sure who sits around that table right now. So it would be nice to get an update on that and really think about how that is aligned with the work of the Public Safety Committee, where we now have the 6 community members who sit around that table. And then secondly, specific to the Public Safety Committee, I wonder if through your analysis, you identified other individuals who probably should be a part of the Public Safety Committee, who are partners at the county, like Chris Becker and others that we're working closely with around public safety. So I just throw that out there. I'm not looking for an answer right now, but I do think it's probably worthwhile to take a little bit closer look and make sure that these different committees are really aligned, because sometimes it can be pretty confusing. And then also for all of us around this table to know who's responsible for appointing who to what, and then how that reports back to the formalized bodies like public safety, which is part of our standing committee. So. All right, commissioners, any final questions or comments as we adjourn and finish up? All right, then I'm going to ask for a motion to go into executive session. Can I get a motion for that? And again, this is to discuss property acquisition.
So moved.
Support.
All right, moved and supported to go into executive session. City Clerk, will you call the vote?
Commissioner O'Connor?
Yes.
Commissioner Moody?
Yes.
Commissioner Isasi?
Yes.
Commissioner Ruppert?
Yes.
Commissioner Lanier?
Aye.
Commissioner Jones?
Yes, I will go.
Mayor Bliss?
Yes. All right, Commissioners. So on this end, our committee of the whole will be back together to finalize items tonight at our 7:00 meeting. Those of you who have public safety, you meet at 3:00. So let's take a 5-minute break and then please go into executive session.